students. Welcome back to LifePoint Students Online. This is actually week 3 of our King of Hearts series. And just as a reminder, if you haven't heard or maybe have been planning to come but haven't had a chance yet, we are meeting in person here at the church 6:30 to 7:30 on Sunday evenings. We do have some fun and fellowship, distant of course, but we also have a lot of Bible discussion, and this same lesson is the same thing we go over on Sunday evenings. So you can either watch and then attend, or attend and then watch, or just do one or the other. Either way, just to highly encourage you, if you can make it, great, and if you can't right now, that's fine too. If you do attend, just have a mask on hand to come, and just in the off chance that maybe we were too close or something like that, then they have a mask at the ready. So please make it if you can, and we'll see you soon, either here or here. So with that said, let's jump into week 3 of the King of Hearts series. And today we're talking about what the king requires. And that comes from 1 Samuel 15. Last week, well, I don't want to jump ahead before we do a recap, but the big idea for today, and this kind of really obviously ties into what we said a lot last week, is that for God to be king, we need to choose his way. And that's kind of what we're going to drive towards the end of this lesson, is that idea that there's no middle ground here. We have to instinctively, we have to consciously choose his direction, his idea for us, his plan and his vision for us, and that we have to choose that each day, or we still have to deal with that same old thought or temptation to do things in our own strength, our own path, our own belief of we can do it our way. So let's actually recap here real quick, and just kind of talk about what we said last week. And last week we talked about sin and how its root is in this idea that we can do things our own way and our own strength. And I think probably that comes from the idea that sometimes we do something ourselves and we find some sort of measure of success. And that kind of promotes us or prompts us to keep going because it feels right. It's like, maybe I had all this strength inside me the whole time. And it's an alluring thought. Don't get me wrong. I've fallen victim to it. You probably have too, is this idea that we have done something in our own strength. And therefore we begin to think this lie of the enemies that we are that good. We are much smarter, wiser than God. And so we keep going. And that's when we get into trouble. And Saul's no different, and because he had the physical presence, he had the military presence, and just kind of had that way of that swagger when he walked into the room, that people just kind of went, yeah, that's the guy, and he liked that. And so he found success with that on his own for a while, and then having to constantly listen to Samuel and God, really, when it comes down to it, that kind of rubbed up against Saul the wrong way. But that sin that he struggled with, that we sometimes struggle with, is that it's rooted in this idea that I can do things on my own, right? And it's the sin that really keeps us from really following God wholeheartedly. We do it a little ways. Saul did it a little ways. I'm sure there were times he thought he was doing it fully. Maybe he convinced himself of that. I don't know. I can't truly say. But I think there are times when you read a little bit about Saul and you go, well, I can see why you can see why he says what he says. You can see maybe why he does what he does. And yet you can see he's not fully committed. It's enough to get some feeling out of it, some excitement out of it, but it's not a full commitment. It's not wholeheartedly. And again, that's the same struggle we have. And that's why we're doing this series, is to look at how, well, we won't call them highlights, but to look at Saul's lowlights and say to ourselves, okay, like, he's not that different from us, but look at what he did here. How can we learn from that? So moving on our recap, before I dive too much into it all, King Saul learned, obviously, this lesson not just once, but often, and usually the hard way. And in last week's lesson, he decided to take on a real tough circumstance. Do I go into this battle? Do I not? And he decides to, and it would be quite a battle. And he takes this circumstance into his own hands, and rather than wait on God's guidance, Samuel, Because of this decision, Saul was told by God that he would lose his dynasty. And from everything we read about his son, he would have been a very, maybe even more righteous leader than Saul. But sadly, because of Saul's decision, he cuts off his dynasty because of this. And God told him that up front. And so once Saul is done, then his reign completely is over. And if you look back at people who had dynasties, that was a prideful point, that their sons would kind of lead forever. And so this would have been probably a heavy blow to Saul, but it still doesn't seem to register. It still doesn't seem to sink in with his decision making after this. And again, we talked about how he decided to go to war without God's approval and guidance. Now, in this situation that we're going to talk about today, God's approval and guidance could not be more clear. God is actually telling Saul now actually to go to war. And so what I like about this is last week, and we're only a few chapters apart here, we see God say, hey, show restraint. This is not the time to go to battle. And then in this lesson, in this chapter, chapter 15, we see God say, okay, now this is where I want you to go to war. And this is what I really appreciate about it. God is directing. God is very specific about where to act or where not to act, where to commit yourself or where not to commit yourself. And God is very clear on that. And yet, it's still somehow Saul misses the mark. And again, I like to pick on Saul, sure. But again, I also say that we're not all that different, you and I. So let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 15. God says, now, go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Pretty clear, right? I think so. So apparently the Amalekites were a brutal people. And you might hear God's decision there it's pretty blunt, right? So, but also clear. But who are the Amalekites, you might ask? Well, they were a very brutal people. They had a history with Israel, a long history actually. And when Israel was coming out of Egypt, they were finally freed of all those years of oppression and bondage. They weren't a prosperous people yet. They were wandering around the desert for 40 years yet to come to the promised land, which would later be the nation of Israel. But as they were traveling and trying to get in the area of the promised land, they often came across the Amalekites and other groups. And the Amalekites often would attack Israel when they were defenseless. Not only did the Amalekites attack Israel, but they had a reputation of being very brutal and preying upon the weak. And it's not just the Amalekites. I think if you ever get a chance to read through a lot of the Old Testament, any group with ites in the back of their name were pagan. And when we talk about paganism and things like that, there is a lot of lewd behavior. Yes, there's a lot of permissive behavior. Human sacrifice, idol worship, their brutality. When we talk about brutality in their army, it wasn't like any real honor in it. They would just come and do whatever they pleased. And so that's why, we see God's wrath is ripe for them. In some other series, we talked about how God would warn the Israelites about what would happen if they didn't change their ways, if they didn't recommit themselves to following God. And certainly the Amalekites were a people group that earned very much this wrath from God, this judgment from God. And Israel was to be that arm of God to bring that about. That's why they had a relationship with God. That's why God established it, not to just bring war or judgment, though it might come to that, but God also wanted to use them to bring peace to the area. So again, that relationship that Israel was to have with God was to do exactly this. Go work on his behalf to the groups of people who deserved through their actions or their sin to be attacked and to be wiped out. And that sounds harsh to us, but this is a time of an era, in a culture that's very different than us now. We didn't live and die by the sword as much as they did in the ancient times. And again, we have to kind of put on some sort of understanding here, some goggles, hat, I don't know, whatever works for you. That we need to understand God chooses to wipe out this group because of their sheer evil, and I can't do it justice by just simply telling you like, they pagan worship and all. To that, we don't necessarily know what all that entails because we don't live it like they did. But suffice it to say, God saw it. And this, to God, was a holy war. And he tells Saul not to take anything for himself. Completely wipe it out, burn it down, whatever. And to be clear, while this story is certainly about Saul, this message is not so much about Saul. This is about God's willingness and need to destroy evil. So eventually we see Saul interact with that vision of God, that desire of God's to remove evil from the earth. And that's kind of where we get stuck with Saul. So God's instructions, as I said, were very crystal clear. Saul, knows exactly what God is telling him to do. He even admits that time and time again. But it kind of gets a little odd there. So as the battle ensues, now you have to remember that the Amalekites might initially have been much more, a lot like the Philistines, much more affluent with gold. A lot of the riches in the ancient world were not so much in gold or silver. Now, of course, that was one thing, but livestock, crops. That's actually where a lot of the land. That's actually where a lot of the wealth came from in the ancient world. So as the battle ensues, Saul sees what the Amalekites have, and what he sees is it begins to, as he is wiping the floor with them, he sees this stuff and he wants it, and what he wants, when he comes to taking out the Amalekites, he wants what he sees. He begins to want that, and throughout this whole battle, he sees all these things and he starts to want it, and he basically eventually takes what he wants. And we're going to talk about that here with this passage here. 1 Samuel 15, 8 through 9. Saul took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive. Okay, so that's strike number one. And all his people he totally destroyed. So of all the people he destroyed, yes, but he keeps Agag. And Saul and the army spared Agag, and they kept the best of the sheep and the cattle, the fat calves and the lambs. So we don't know the number of that, but the choicest ones. So maybe it's only a handful of each. We don't really know. Everything that was good, essentially, is anything that maybe in even gold or silver or what have you, anything that was good they kept. These they were unwilling to destroy. So it wasn't just Saul. Of course, that mandate came from Saul. The army might have wanted to follow through, but followed Saul's instructions. They were unwilling to destroy completely. But everything that was despised, everything that was weak, they destroyed. So they found things probably easily, maybe many things easy to destroy, but yet they still couldn't hold on. They still wanted to hold on to these one or two things here, these one or two things here. And again, that's kind of the insidiousness of sin, is that we can follow it up, we can do our faith up to a point, but then we still want to have a little bit of the world there, and we want to hold on to that. So in a sense, Saul does what God wants. 90%, 95%, 99%, I don't know. He takes out the Amalekites, but Saul chooses to do it his way. So he takes the best of what he sees, and maybe Agag is, a prize to gloat, to travel around with and being like, hey, look what I did. Maybe he even thinks maybe later on he'll use him because there's other groups and nations around, and he can pull Agag out and be like, see what happened to him, see what I did. Whatever the case, Agag's not supposed to be there, as per God's instructions. So fast forward several days, Saul and the Israelites are celebrating this huge victory, their victory, at least probably in Saul's eyes, until Samuel shows up. Now you can probably guess what's going to happen here. And again, I can't stress enough, when we see Samuel, yes, he is a person, but he's God's chosen voice among people, right? And so if we see Samuel's presence, you can bet more often than not that his speaking, his reaction to things might be his very own, but there's a lot of influence of God there as well. So 1 Samuel, the couple verses later, 13 and 14, Saul saw Samuel and says, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." Samuel responded, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" So Samuel clearly knows that those things aren't supposed to be there. Samuel then reminds Saul of God's clear instructions. And he says, "Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder?" So clearly they grabbed gold and whatever else they could. And why did you do evil in the eyes of the Lord? So everything that Samuel's saying through God, by God, is this means nothing. You've won, but you've disobeyed me. Saul responds that he did obey the Lord, and it only took from the Amalekites to offer a sacrifice. And here we are. So Saul is basically, and maybe he believes this, I don't know. Maybe he convinced himself of this. Maybe he truly did feel like, I'm going to win this battle, and then I'm going to take these things, and I won't kill them, but I'll use them as a sacrifice later. Whatever the case, or maybe he just thought, I'm caught. Now I have to try and slaughter these, or sacrifice these animals to make it look like I was doing it for God. In either case, both are disobedient. Whether one sounds better than the other to us, but both are disobedience. So, Saul is kind of stuck here. He thinks I'm going to do this my way, and then maybe I'll just sacrifice these animals as a way of honoring God. But Samuel's response to Saul still echoes all these thousands of years later. And this is kind of what I want to get to. It's not about doing the churchy thing. It's not about making this sacrifice or this religious act. 1 Samuel 15, 22, 23. What is more pleasing to the Lord? Your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, okay, so the Bible is emphasizing that we need to listen here. Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness is as bad as worshiping idols. So basically, the same reason God would bring judgment upon the Amalekites, this of idol worship, witchcraft, and paganism, is likened to Saul's actions of stubbornness and sinfulness, rebellion. So to God, they're one and the same. Your rebellion is of any other kind of brand of rebellion. Your stubbornness in listening to me or not listening to me is as bad as any other sin of idol worship, because you're kind of making yourself your own idol. Your own brain, your own wisdom, it becomes your own idol. And so that's why Samuel attacks the real heart of the sin here. God wasn't looking for religious acts. He's looking for an obedient heart, a heart that's trusting him, by the way. And again, when we go off in these rants or these tangents or these paths that we think are our own making, like I said earlier, we begin to maybe find some success, and so we keep heading down that path. The problem is that really is the path of disobedience. And we begin to say, even in our own heart, I can do it all in my own way, my own strength. And God looks at that heart. And no amount of religious acts or partial obedience can cover that up. So it doesn't matter, if 6 days out of the week you're living and doing things for yourself, and then you show up on Sunday, you sit in the chair, you sit in the pew, you watch this video, you watch other videos, and you kind of do the religious thing for a bit. You might as well be doing a burnt offering, but yet you're not really being fully, wholeheartedly committed to God. And again, this is the struggle of not just you or myself. This is the struggle of humanity. It's the struggle that we see in Saul. So again, let Saul be our example here of what not to do. And God is basically saying the only requirement for you and I, the only requirement He needs from us to use in big ways, to use us in any big way, is that our heart is in sync with Him and it belongs to Him and that He indwells us. Saul tried to live out the life God wanted him. We see that sometimes. He starts heading into it, trying to follow God, and then he totally veers off. So he starts to do things God, but all the while, there's that old rebellious belief in his heart that he can do things his own way and find success. Proverbs puts it this way. This is chapter 14, verse 12. There is a way that appears right, and in some versions it says there's a way that appears right to a man, but in the end, it leads to death. I make that distinction only because in really the translation, it says man, but it means humanity. So there's a way that seems right to a person, to all of us, and yet our own path, that path that we choose, leads to death. And let's talk about that for a moment. Our way does lead to death. If Christ didn't come and bring us His salvation through His sacrifice, our daily living alone, as sinful as it probably would always be, would warrant death. That's what the Word tells us. So our path, our way of doing things, would lead to death. Doing life our way only is a life without God, but also an eternity without Him. Now, remember, sometimes the worst thing that God can do is actually give us what we want. And when I say that, I mean this, that if we continue to act in our own path, in our own direction, we are essentially asking God to step out of the way, remove His presence or His grace from us. And God has said in the Word, Romans especially, you want to head down that path, I will give that to you, because as you keep heading down this path, doing this thing your way, you are basically asking me to leave. So, God does offer at some point that option. And I can tell you that I'm sure none of us want that, because He will give us that desire if we continue to do that. And yet, He will welcome us back, but probably not before we walk through a whole lot of problems. We see that with Saul. Problem after problem, he, rather than draws closer to God, he draws more away from God, more into this belief that I'm the man, I can do whatever I want. And the Bible says that at one point, this world was filled with people. We know that. That's before the flood, yes. Walking around saying, I can do it my way. That's why God did the whole reset with the flood. And I would say, in large part, we see a lot of that today. Look around, look at the media. Everything is telling you to, and basically, even in some cases, trying to force you into living your own truth, living your own path, doing whatever you want. It is the Christian, it is the Christ followers, the church that's saying, no, we need to live by this standard. God's Word is screaming at us to live by His biblical standard. And while we know that's not easy, especially in a world like we face today, it is the right thing, and that's what we're saying here. The problem is that, in pre-flood times, their way got them just, it got them physical death, but it also brings a spiritual death when we receive the full judgment of God. And I just want to bring this back around real quick, really to a close. We said, at the beginning that, God, to be king in our hearts, we need to choose Him daily. And we know there are consequences to sin. Maybe you felt them personally, maybe you felt them secondary from someone else sinning against you. Whatever the case, we know that there is a consequence to sin, and yet sometimes we still head down that path. My encouragement to you today is if you want to struggle less with that, we may struggle with it, we still may be tempted with it, but I think for us to choose God's way daily, every moment of every day, is not easy. But it gets easier the more we draw towards God, read His Word, be in prayer, be amongst other people in prayer with them, reading the Word with them. Do you see what I'm going at here? It's Christ following, while it's personal and individual, is also not a solo sport. It's a team sport. And so with that, I would encourage you to stay connected to the Word, stay connected in prayer, and stay connected with one another. Stay connected with those in the church, because that's how we don't fall into the traps of Saul and others like him. So with that, I hope you've been encouraged, and have a great day, and we'll see you later.